representing three of the nation's largest states, and are excited by the conversation that we are about to have. To start, I'm going to go ahead and begin us with a brief video about the edTrends series and the work that we're doing, and then we'll move on to the panel. So I hope you'll be able to join us in the future for other events, and my thanks to Dr. Jerry Rivera-Wilson, who directs our Atlas Center, for her work in that as well. Let me just quickly pull up our, well, let me not do that. There we go. Pull up our PowerPoint as we get moving, but I'll just start by saying edTrends was started about a year ago, in fact, in response to the COVID pandemic, because we recognized that there was an important role to play in connecting K-12 and higher education together and collectively navigating the space. The University of Albany is one of the nation's leaders in terms of providing graduate online education. It's something that we have done for about 20 years, and we felt that we had an opportunity to be able to work with our K-12 colleagues to be able to provide some resources that they may not have had. And so we started the website remoteed.org as a way to actually provide a clearinghouse of resources, free online resources available to teachers and parents and others in the community. It is, with that, we pivoted to providing edTrends, a weekly series now to bring leaders, education leaders and practitioners together to talk about critical issues facing schools and colleges and communities as we collectively navigated what has been a marathon of a crisis affecting education. And of course, we know that while education is very local, we also know that it is critical to be able to, that our state leaders are playing important roles in guiding the policy and practice of our leaders. And so we're thrilled to be able to talk with three of the nation's leaders in who have helped navigate our districts in this response. So the agenda for today, I got ahead of myself. Well, first, I also want to thank our partners, Cognia, the Lastinger Center at the University of Florida, and the Center for Future of Teaching and Learning at West Ed, who have been remarkable partners with us as we've navigated this space and who have broadened our reach to think more about what's happening at the national level and comparing notes across states, which has been incredibly helpful. Well, I'm getting a note saying I'm not loud enough. Can you all hear me? we okay?
Maybe a little louder.
A little louder. All right. Well, I'll try to get it a little bit closer here on these things. Technology is great until it doesn't work.
Exactly.
See if this helps a little bit more. Can you hear me now? All right,
Yes.
great. So our agenda today is really we're going to ask each of our panelists to be able to share a little bit about what's happening in their states. And as background for this conversation, we have a set of questions and answers that we're going to work through collectively and dialogue together to learn about how they are each responding in their own contexts. We gathered questions from you all, and we'll pose a couple of those as well, and then we'll move to closing statements. But our hope here is to have a dialogue and a discussion and to collectively learn from each other about what's happening across California, Florida, and New York. And so with us today are our three panelists, Dr. Stephanie Gregson, who is the Chief Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction at the California Department of Education. We have Dr. Eric Hall, who is the Senior Chancellor from the Florida Department of Education. And we have John DeGotti, who is the Senior Deputy Commissioner at the New York State Education Department. And so with that, let me turn to them first, and I'll go in the order of states. And so Stephanie, if I could ask you to start with a few comments.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Jason. Thank you for having me here. I appreciate it. So, as Jason mentioned, I'm Stephanie Gregson. I'm Chief Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction for the state of California. I've had this position now for just over a year. So that means I've only known this role within a pandemic. So quite an interesting jump into the role. I'm also here on behalf of our state superintendent, Tony Thurman, who appointed me over a year ago, and I became the first educator chief deputy in over 20 years for the state of California, because I began my career as a teacher, and I'm always a teacher. So just to give you some context for the state of California, as far as education is concerned, we have 6.2 million students that we serve across over 1,000 school districts in 10,000 schools. And we have over 319,000 teachers that are serving those students. We have an extremely diverse student population and demographics across our 58 counties within the state. And so we have a big job to do serving that many students. Our top priorities are, first and foremost, during this time, helping our schools get the resources and support they need to continue and accelerate a safe return to in-person learning. That includes robust COVID testing, prioritizing teachers for vaccinations, making sure that they have the funds and resources to get all of those safety protocols in place, along with the academic supports for our students as well. We published our Stronger Together guidance in May of last year that really took the foundation of looking at reflecting on our systems, because our system wasn't working for every student. And so using this as an opportunity to innovate and reflect on our systems to see what we needed to change to make sure that we were lifting up, caring, and educating every student. We also have had a focus of social emotional learning, because this has been an extraordinary time, not only for our students, but the adults that are serving our students. And we want to make sure that they are mentally healthy before we even address the academics. So we have been focused on the social emotional learning aspects for all. Family engagement has been a huge priority during this time, because we have many families who are struggling, economic struggles during this time, and disconnecting, and had choices to make around priorities of how they spent their time. We also have been focused on closing the digital divide. California is the home to Silicon Valley, yet we had over 1 million students that weren't able to connect, and that's pretty sad. So we have, our state superintendent formed the Closing the Digital Divide Task Force in partnership with our legislative members, and called our internet service providers to task around looking at our connectivity. We also were looking at how do we address learning supports for our students that struggled during distance learning. We had some that thrived and some that struggled, and so wanting to make sure that we address those. And as I said before, just taking this opportunity to innovate, and also looking at our equity and access issues, because this pandemic only exacerbated and amplified what we've already known for our Black and Brown students. And so we started an Education and Hate initiative, and making sure that we are using that as our foundation for all of our policy and practices. So Jason, I'll hand it off to you to go to our next state.
We will jump all the way to Florida, but I appreciate you sharing that, Stephanie. And I think particularly the issue how this has exasperated challenges that already existed and brought those to the forefront. We'll tackle those later on. So we'll jump over to Florida, and Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Appreciate it, Jason. And again, it's good to be here with you. And as mentioned, my name is Eric Hall, and I'm Senior Chancellor here at the department. And, I'll kind of, start this conversation much the way, Stephanie did. I'll ground this in the sense I've been in my role for about 2 years, returning to Florida after having served as the Deputy State Superintendent in North Carolina just before that, and then coming back here to my home state of Florida to really serve in this role where, here at our department, we are, very fortunate that we have a system that is fairly well unified. So under our State Department of Education, we support our Office of Early Learning, our K-12 system, grade adult education, as well as our college system. And so knowing that we kind of have this ability to look across, from our youngest learners to our adult learners, we really approach this from the standpoint going into this pandemic about how do we break down these silos and really start designing, strategic initiatives and plans that we're going to seamlessly address, some of the barriers and hurdles that we were going to have to overcome. And I also want to, kind of ground this conversation as someone who started my career as a public school educator. My parents are both public school teachers. And coming into this discussion, I look at this as a parent of 2 kids who are in our public school system. My wife is a school social worker working in the education system. And so again, I get all these different discussions and narratives that come up as we're looking at how do we support continuity of learning and support during this period of time. And so I'll go back to March 13th, which for us, just about a year ago, like many other states around the nation, we were, looking at what decisions do we need to make to ensure the safety and health of our students, our staff, and our families. And Florida made a pivot. And I say a pivot, we didn't close schools. We made a pivot from brick and mortar operations to distance learning. And Florida has a long history of over 2 decades of being pretty committed to having a virtual school option. So we were able to move pretty quickly during the course of what many were taking as spring breaks during that time with our schools and move our students to a distance learning model, able to leverage the resources of our Florida virtual school in many cases, which again has over 2 decades of service and support here in our state. We've had robust policies that have worked with our districts to ensure that we have opportunities and access for virtual school and distance learning options. And so we made that pivot. And while that pivot was a tough decision, and our educators are really the unsung heroes in that situation, and our school leaders, they made that pivot and they did it quickly. And we worked with parents and families to make sure that, again, we didn't stop the learning process. Was it what we wanted it to be? No, but was it something that we maximized the resources and the supports that we had? But we made that pivot. And again, we continue to finish out the school year. Going into the summer, we took some time and we really thought very carefully about how we were going to design really and truly our first CARES Act plan. We were looking at going back to our youngest learners and what were the conditions that were in place, looking at, for example, our early learning system where we have nearly 11,000 child care providers across the state, providing school readiness supports, our VPK programs, which we have a universal and voluntary pre-K opportunity here in our state that funds 3 hours a day for our 4 and 5-year-olds. We've had that for quite some time, but we looked at that and we said, okay, what are we going to do in our CARES Act plan to address opportunities and access for families? At that point in time in April, we had about 42% of our child care providers open. Today, because of the strategies and efforts that we took to provide opportunity and access to families, we have nearly 99% of our child care providers open here in the state. We did that through investments and strategies that help to support our early learning provider networks. And we did that with the focus of how do we keep children connected to the supports and services that they need during that time, especially our VPK students that were going to be rising kindergartners. And then in our CARES Act plan, again, seamlessly building our early learning into our K-12, we made strategic investments about having summer bridge opportunities to close gaps that we were concerned about for our children that were served, in that distance learning model in late spring and into the summer. We looked at how we were going to create opportunities with extended learning supports going into the school year. We made sure that we made strategic investments with 2 primary focus, two major focuses of our plan was around safety and health of our staff and students. And the other, much like Stephanie mentioned, how are we going to look at the academic achievement gaps that we were concerned about and had been exacerbated potentially during that time because of some of the hurdles and barriers that some families may have been having to face with that pivot into distance learning. But I would say across the board, we designed this CARES Act plan with seamless, strategies from, our youngest learners into K-12. And then what were we doing to really help support our workforce by also investing money into rapid credentials that would help our individuals in our state colleges and our technical colleges to get credentials as the economy was shifting, to create those conditions for them to have opportunity for upward mobility during this period of time. And I think we're seeing the effects of that here in Florida, where we've had an economy that's been open. We made our decisions based on the science, and we used that science to inform where we went at the beginning of this school year with our first emergency order that basically directed all schools in our state to have schools open brick and mortar 5 days a week. And when we made that decision back in August, and we made that pivot, and we worked with our districts, our superintendents were partners. We worked through that. We had, some districts, because of some of the local spread in their communities, some of our areas like Miami, Fort Lauderdale, up into Palm Beach, they moved in about a month to a month and a half later after all other schools were able to open. But going into the winter, we had all 73 of our school districts open with brick and mortar services available to families that wanted that choice. And so, again, strategic investments, designing our CARES Act plan, getting funds into the hands of our schools to help support these initiatives, redeploying the 10% set aside that we had at the state level to support these initiatives to help address some of these barriers. And then through our emergency orders, giving parents the choices that they needed to ensure the safety and health for them and their families and for their child, but also, again, creating those options for families that wanted their child in that brick and mortar option. To where here we are today, building on that success during the first half of this school year, we are at now, nearly 2/3 of the students in our state are attending in-person learning. We have, just unbelievable success right now that's taking place with schools continuing to, increase the capacity, more parents bringing, their children back into school campuses. And our district leaders and school leaders and teachers have been working through this. Again, has everything always, been, easy? No, but we've worked through it. And again, I go back to the unsung heroes, which goes back to our teachers, our school leaders, our superintendents, and working hand in hand on these strategies to where, again, we've been, I think, very successful in creating choice opportunities for families, using the technology that we have for those families that need that kind of support or that kind of opportunity, but also creating the conditions through that technology through contact tracing when students needed to transition from brick and mortar potentially to a period of 2 weeks back at home for learning. That kind of continuity for us has just been, I think, a real success in our state. And again, the numbers are showing that what we're doing is having facilities open to provide childcare and early learning supports, creating the supports at our K-12 system, and our state colleges continue to have more and more students coming back on campus to continue their progression into post-secondary, education and training. So again, look forward to having more conversations as we dive into these details more in the narrative and the discussion ahead. But again, appreciate the opportunity, Jason, and really, appreciate the opportunity to engage also with my colleagues from California and from New York.
I appreciate that overview and that the particularly thinking through the whole pipeline, right, in terms of education, and we'll get back to that later on. So let me bring it up to New York and have John DeGotti share a little bit about what's happening here in our neck of the woods.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Thank you to all. John DeGotti, Senior Deputy Commissioner. I have been in this position about a year and a half. I came on board a little before the pandemic, but before that I worked at the State Ed Department as the Deputy for the Office of Higher Education. The department has broad overview, P12, higher education. We have oversight over adult education, museums in New York, just about any educational institution the State Ed Department has oversight. We are an old institution established in the late 1700s, so we go way back. One thing that is somewhat unique, I believe, is the fact that while we are governed by a Board of Regents, the Board of Regents are appointed by the legislature. The governor has no appointments to the Board of Regents. So they are somewhat independent. We have about 700 districts in New York, about 200,000 teachers, a little over 2 million students. We're very diverse, particularly we have what we call Big Five districts: Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, Syracuse, and New York City, and Yonkers included in that. And so we have inner cities, we have suburban, and we have rural districts. And they certainly each have their there's some common challenges that they all face, and there are some unique challenges. Not to repeat what my colleague Stephanie discussed, but we certainly experience the same concerns. There is the COVID, the pandemic, and moving to remote, having to move to a remote learning mode has certainly exacerbated the digital divide. You know, it's a complex issue. It's not just about having a computer at home. It's not just about having access to broadband, but it can be any combination thereof. Hard to find a single solution to any one of these things. And as probably my colleagues can tell you, that, you know, we also have a very decentralized system where local boards of education have a lot of control over the day-to-day operations of the district within the parameters that we set through our regulatory environment. So we have faced a lot of the same challenges. We are working through them. We continue to try to be as flexible as we can with our regulations. And I'm sure we will talk more about that going down the road. I know that we have started what we kind of term a digital equity summit, where we're having meetings with a cross-section of stakeholders around the state, including broadband providers and others, businesses, to try to come up with solutions for some of the challenges we face for teachers and students to meaningfully engage in the education system while we are in this kind of mode of operation. Many of our schools remain in hybrid mode, and you know, there are challenges with that. So with that, Jason, I'll follow up with additional, you know, as we go through the questions.
All right, thanks, John. And we are going to move to the questions now. I would say here are three of the ones that are coming up. But I'm going to stop share so that we can see everybody. I think we'd rather dialogue here amongst ourselves. And I'll pose the questions to the group as we move forward. And, you know, you all highlighted several challenges that are happening in each of your states. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more and about what are the principles guiding your decisions as you are developing, you know, education policy and practices at the statewide level. I don't know, Eric, you picked up a little bit on sort of, I think, opportunity and access in your opening remarks. Maybe I can turn to you first to respond to this.
Definitely, I appreciate that, Jason. I would say, you know, I go back to some of the comments that I made at the beginning where we kind of had 2 points that we kept front and center as we were going in to the design of our CARES plan and what we did with reopening of schools this fall. And that was number one, focus on safety and health again of our students and our staff. And the second was focus on how do we address closing gaps that we're concerned about during this period of time. You know, we've all seen the work that's been done, you know, nationally and here in Florida. I think we're very proud of the work that we've accomplished in closing gaps over the years. But at the same time, we did not want to see a retreat from that work that's been done. We didn't want to see ourselves start moving backwards. And so, you know, some of the things that we did through the CARES plan, and this is going back to those priorities. Yes, we worked with districts to look at how do we create safe and healthy environments and the conditions with PPE. I mean, again, our local leaders really did a phenomenal job creating those conditions at their school sites and getting those things in place. But we also looked at how did we deploy additional resources with, for example, we established regional literacy directors that are out working with districts to help improve teacher support training. And we launched what is really the largest scale data collection for progress monitoring in our state, where we are collecting data. You know, each district has their own vendor that they might use from a progress monitoring tool to look at, you know, multiple data points throughout the year to see how students are growing. And that's always been something that we've had for years with our district reading plans. But, you know, knowing that you have multiple models of progress monitoring tools, we adopted a platform that allows us to collect that from all districts and all schools to start looking at the growth measures and what was happening. And that was all with the intention of how do we use that data to see how students are growing during this period of time, so that our regional literacy directors and investments we were making around supplemental academic supports for proven evidence-based reading supports, getting those tools in place so that, again, we're preparing our teachers even more so to look at strategies and tools they could use to help accelerate learning during this time, because of some of the concerns that we had where there could have been some slide during this period of time with, again, the growth that's been achieved. So we continue to build on that. You know, we are looking at, in this next round of CARES funding, how do we build on some of those successes as we design our state level plan, working with our districts with the CRISA funds. We're looking at, you know, we've had great conversations, you know, where here recently in Florida, legislature has recently launched a bill that further builds on our success with literacy efforts here in the state. So I think what we're doing is we're seeing this really, massive responsive environment that's taking progress monitoring for our BPK students as a pilot to see how we're looking at their growth measures towards kindergarten readiness, looking at how are we using this data to inform how we support, more with professional development at the local level, looking at how we've partnered with the University of Florida and the Lastinger Center to provide more of our teachers with training and support for the literacy matrix and using the science of reading to build, again, educator capacity, especially in those early grade levels so that we can close those gaps before students get beyond the third grade. And that's where, again, I think for us, we've tried to use the information and the data that we're collecting during this time to build that capacity of our educators, because again, I think as long as you build your workforce to be responsive in this time, and in this case, building the capacity of our teachers, which again, I get it. The more we can build the capacity of our teachers to do this work during this time, the more successful our students are going to be. And we've been intentional about getting more and more of our students back into our brick and mortar schools, because the other things that really have driven us during this period of time is the fact that we have so many of our children that depend on that meal each day from school. When you look at over 60% of our students being economically disadvantaged, we have to get our kids back in there for those meals. Having that support of other wraparound services that address the non-academic barriers that so many of our children may be facing, so that, if we address the non-academic barriers with these supports, then we're going to create the conditions for learning and accelerated growth in areas like reading with the other strategies that I've mentioned. So those are some of the things I think we've done pretty well.
No, it's great. And it sounds like you've been forward looking also about not just what you're doing now, but how this might be able to continue into the future. Stephanie, maybe I could turn to you and California. How are you thinking about these challenges? What's guiding your decision making?
Well, what's guiding our decision making is listening to our students, listening to our parents, listening to our educators, and all of our different stakeholders within California, all of our equity groups and our school and county leaderships. And the superintendent and our team have made an extreme effort from the very beginning to ensure that all of our conversations were as inclusive as possible. And because we needed to learn what was impacting our parents and our students and our educators the most, to help build our understanding around when we are working with our legislators and making the policy decisions and coming to an agreement on how to move forward, is that those voices were the main voices heard in the decision-making process. So those were a very large part of our guiding posts as we moved forward in creating policies and practices to support schools during this time. And we had the legislator develop the learning continuity and attendance plan that was required by each of our local education agencies, all of our schools and districts. And the focus was mainly on how are you supporting your students in their mental health and well-being, and your educators? How are you monitoring academic progress, like Eric talked about? We need to know and understand where our students are at to be able to plan accordingly to move them forward in their learning. As we saw, some thrived. Our high school students thrived. But our elementary school student age students, as you can imagine, kindergarten, first grade, they struggled, because learning how to read in a distance learning remote environment is extremely difficult, and especially keeping the attention of those little 5 and 6 year olds. Thank goodness for kindergarten and first grade teachers. And we used all of this information again to help our districts understand what was working well for them and what do we need to do, reflect on in our own guidance and practices from the state agency. Because that was, I think John talked about this around the flexibility of our regulations and our guidance has come into huge play during this time, is how are we as a state agency looking at things differently to better support our schools. And so those are some of the guiding principles that we've used during this time.
As somebody with a kindergartner, I appreciated your comments about the difficulty with them being remote learning. It was certainly a struggle, but we're learning a lot through it ourselves as parents and new levels of patience as we move forward. You talked a little bit about social emotional in your opening statements, and you just touched on it again. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you're helping schools think about the social emotional pieces of students.
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, our state superintendent, Thurman, created a mental health coalition to help create a patchwork of mental health services across the state. We have a very large state. We have a lot of state agencies and a lot of local agencies that are responsible for mental health. So we wanted to get them all in the room talking to each other and understanding where the needs and supports were and how we can better work together. And so that Mental Health Coalition has been active for almost a year now, and ensuring that access is provided to those students and the parents that need that access the most to mental health supports. We've also done a ton of professional learning series with various mental health and well-being partners across the state for all of our teachers. We've done support circles for our parents and our students. We've really worked on amplifying the student voice during this time because they are the ones that are experiencing the most hardship and are impacted the most. And they are the voices that we needed to listen to and understand in order to provide them the best support as possible. And so we've had quite a few webinars and professional learning series with Wellness Together, our Youth Mental Health First Aid. We've created a survey for our parents and our students to get a better understanding of what type of supports, what kind of environment they're in at home, and how can we pull out that data to better educate our districts and our counties and our state agencies in understanding what our students need.
That's terrific, and we all know how much that home environment is impacting our students right now. John, let me bring it over to New York then. Talk a little bit about what's guiding our decision making here.
Yeah, I mean, like my colleague said, I mean, I think first and foremost, the concern and the focus and the decision making is grounded in what are the students' needs, how will our any change we make affect students. I will tell you that, we have become a much more open, engaged agency. We are constantly in contact with, almost on a weekly basis, with district superintendents, boards of executive committees of boards of education, principals associations, teachers associations, to get feedback from them. And, the decision making, and we have relied on the expertise in the field. I can't think of a policy that we have implemented where we have not engaged the field, leaders that we work with at various levels of school districts and higher ed as well, to bounce ideas off them. How will this affect you? How will this improve the situation? Will it work? One of the other challenges we've had, Jason, is coordination. In our state, the Department of Health has taken the lead on setting, guidelines for student health and safety. And so, it was critical for us to be lockstep with the Department of Health in what they were recommending, and then engaging the Department of Health to say, well, what you're recommending may not be working in certain school district environments. They're experts when it comes to health and safety. They know very little about what a classroom is like, and that's not their role. So we've had to coordinate quite a bit with them, and that's not very common. We're kind of an independent agency, but it has worked out well, and we've developed really good working relationships with the department, and certainly with the governor's office as well. And they are the conduit for both agencies. So that has been a big part of our work. And as I said before, the challenges, there remain challenges. There were districts that even before the pandemic had challenges, and this has exacerbated those challenges. But again, we have provided as much flexibility. We certainly in-house have improved our technical assistance, our ability to advise and work with districts who face those challenges. We were fortunate enough to get a $20 million federal grant to provide professional development for teachers and administrators. And we are using that to to really help improve our ability to assist and provide additional support. Because again, some teachers, some administrators were able to kind of glide right into the new world order, so to speak. Others have really faced challenges, and I think we've been able to help in many ways. In the work that they're trying to do. So that's what.
So it's been interesting to watch the headlines recently, and the national media has certainly focused on education a lot. The packet, the latest Relief Act, a lot of attention on what's happening with children, the current administration, the focus on reopening the physical space of schools, focus on New York City and LA, right, the big cities in terms of are they reopening or not. For you in your roles at the state level, as we look toward, sort of rounding third, right, coming into home of the school year, closing out in the next few months, what's top of mind for you as we look at the end of the school year this year? And John, maybe I can pick on you first because you've gone last the last couple of times, so I'll reverse order.
Well, I'll tell you, there's a range of issues. Finishing up the year is it's important. There's a lot of controversy, obviously, or stresses around assessments, statewide assessments, regents exams. If you're local, you know what that is. And but it is important to, and regardless of how that all plays out, it's so important to get a read on, where students are currently. Who's going to need additional support, additional help as they move. Either, especially for those students moving through high school, moving from 11th to 12th grade, 10th to 11th, 11th to 12th. I think that, and one of the things I have talked about internally is engaging counseling. School counselors become such a critical part of this conversation. Mm-hmm. We know that college enrollment is down significantly in New York. And very, very worried about the fact that many students are just not, they're completing their high school and not enrolling in college. And finding out why and how to address that is certainly a priority of our departments going forward. But also making sure that they are ready and going again back to my colleagues, making sure that the social emotional environment in which they are in can influence their decisions about what they want to do as they transition out of high school or complete high school, or even move from 10th to 11th grade, 11th to 12th grade. There's just a lot of challenges there. And that's something that is very much on our mind. I mean, we looked at data last year, and there's some concerning data about graduation rates and who's graduating. And did they complete as they were supposed to? Do they need more support, more lessons? What are the gaps in their education and how can we help them? So that's something that is very much on our mind. I'll tell you, Jason, it's one thing to look at a piece of paper and look at a plan that somebody has provided on paper, and that plan can be, 10 pages of graphics. And that's all very nice, and it could be a lot of color, and but following the plan in real world is a much bigger challenge. And having the right people in place, the staff, personalities make a difference as well. Is also a challenge that we are very much aware of. So.
It's great. And all those transitions, right, as we move forward are going to be interesting to see how they navigate. Somebody sitting in higher ed, we're looking at those numbers closely about folks who are interested in coming to college or not. And wondering also not just who's coming, but what supports they might need when they get here because of what's happened this past year as well. It'll be an interesting transition to navigate. Stephanie, how about California? What's a focus for you moving forward?
Well, I'm hoping that we don't forget the lessons learned during this time. I think that's a huge focus around what have we learned. John mentioned assessment. We've had to really reflect on our assessment system and protocols and how we use the data coming out from those assessments. What are the most useful assessments? And so as we return into in-person instruction, and we have many of our schools looking at the end of March, beginning of April for our transitional kindergarten through 6th grade students returning to in-person instruction, and our high school students are looking at more of end of April, beginning of May. And you mentioned LA, you just announced that they will also be looking at opening in April. So we have this time between now and June to where we are looking at what have we learned as we welcome students back to in-person instruction. We have some freshmen that have never been on a high school campus. What's that going to look like for them? Kindergartners that have never met their teacher in person, and first graders, the same thing. So what does that look like? And focus in on how to support them transitioning from being at home with mom and dad, mostly moms, all day into new in-person instruction, and then assessing where they're at academically and being able to move them forward so that when we return in fall, we know where every student is and we can accelerate their learning and making sure that they're also mentally well as they enter a new school year. So for us, it's around our lessons learned and the innovation opportunities, because I would hate to see us not take this opportunity. It took a pandemic for us to reflect on our systems, and it's something that should not be wasted, of how we look at accountability and assessment and measuring student growth and how we approach our students' learning. Because what we have found is distance learning works for some, just like in-person worked for some. So what will work for all, and being able to reflect on our systems and have something different happen.
It's a great point, because early in the pandemic, I heard a lot of folks talk about let's see what we can learn from this, right? And use this crisis to move forward. Now what I hear a lot of, let's get back to normal. Right, we've been in it for so long. People want to get back to normal. They want to see normalcy somehow take place. And I think for a lot of folks, that means back in the classrooms, right, the physical way that things look normal. How do we just navigate that, Stephanie, a little bit? So I'm going to push you a little bit further on that conversation about lessons learned. Right, how do we navigate getting back to normal while also holding on to some of these innovations and continuing to move forward?
Well, I think we have a responsibility at the state level to continue those conversations and to reflect internally. We're a very large state agency, and we have to be able to model for our school districts how we want them to approach. And so we ourselves have to reflect on our own systems, because we create the system. We created the system, and then therefore we can create a new system. And so looking at, as a state agency, how are we supporting our districts differently from all of our lessons learned, and then keep that conversation going and not let up. Have it embedded and integrated into every professional learning, every guidance we put out, every interaction that we have with our local education agencies.
Terrific. So Eric, Florida, where are you moving? What are you looking at moving forward?
Well, I'll tell you a couple things, and there was a couple comments that were made, I think, between John and Stephanie that triggered a couple of thoughts. And I'm going to go backwards to go forward for just a second, Jason.
Go for it.
When we did our order back here in the, early fall to get schools reopened and to have that option for families with brick and mortar, I think one of the things that I heard John talk about is some of the enrollment trends and some of the changes that we have seen this year. One of the things that we did very intentionally was that, we moved in a direction by doing this order to create these options and choices, but we also did it with an intentional effort to keep schools financially whole. Because with those enrollment trends, we would have seen massive, cuts in budgets, because we have a survey formula where we take a count in October that drives funding essentially, roughly, for the first 90 days of school. If we did not keep the order in place and keep our schools financially whole, we would have seen potential losses in our instructional personnel and districts having to make tough budgetary choices. So it's hard to talk about educational continuity when you have disruption to the professionals that are doing that work. I think, that's where we had to really focus at the beginning, that while we were going to create these conditions to create choices, we were also doing it with an intentionality around how do we keep districts and systems whole during this time so that they could focus on the quality of instruction and support all the way around. So that's, again, that success, we built on that with EO7. And I think lessons learned this year is that our teachers, again, when confronted with challenge, they step up and they deliver and do great things. And, I think as we go forward, we are fortunate that here in Florida, the governor has really come out with, I think, a very strong budget proposal that continues to actually increase funding in our education system per student is what's being proposed, looking at how do we keep additional funding going into supporting the addition of more school counselors and social workers in our schools to support, again, those non-academic barriers that many of our children may be facing. And we're doing this at a time where, again, states are having to have a lot of discussions about budgets and budget decisions going forward. And so I think for us, we're looking at how do we build on the success with having, again, a trend that's showing more and more of our families making the choice to put their children back in front of the teachers that are creating those environments of success and support, getting those other professionals wrapped around our students. And, I heard you talk about that sense of normalcy. How do we do that in a way that, again, by next fall, I think we're going to see a significant number of our families make that pivot, fully back into school. Again, we're over, now about 2/3 of our parents have made that choice for their children in our brick and mortar schools across the state. But as we're doing that, we also have to recognize some of the gaps that have grown during that time. And that's where, for us going into next year, we're going to double down on the initiatives that support literacy. Again, bridging what we're doing in our VPK programs, our pre-kindergarten classrooms. What are we doing to support them with that kindergarten readiness? How are we using assessment to drive some of those strategies for acceleration in academic growth? Doing, again, a lot of work with professional development and engagement with everyone from our school administrators to our reading coaches that we have deployed around the state, looking at how do we build up those competencies to drive the work around, again, the literacy matrix. We're just going to, again, continue to double down. I think the real story for here in Florida has been that there's no doubt that the pandemic has created challenges and it's created barriers that nobody wanted. We didn't want to see these things happen. We saw a lot of great things happening in our state. And of course, as a nation, we've seen unbelievable things happen that, again, states have been doing really, really, just great things, trying to continue to build and close these gaps. But amidst this pandemic, one of the things that I think Florida has really, just done exceptionally well is that the same goals that we had in place before the pandemic remained our goals during the pandemic. And we have not allowed ourselves to be distracted from getting off target from those goals. Whether it, again, was looking at how do we close academic gaps in reading by 3rd grade, we said, no, let's take the investments and deploy there to put more supports in place so that we don't lose that ground. We said, you know what, the governor came out early on with Executive Order 1931 about workforce education and making sure that we have upward mobility with career opportunities to middle to high wage careers. We doubled down on that with rapid credentials and helping to create, again, pathways in career opportunities beyond our secondary programs. So I think, again, the narrative for us has been, we're still looking forward. We're staying strategic with the goals that we've had, but doing it in a way that addresses and balances, again, those non-academic barriers with the supports that we know students need during this time, while saying in the end, let's continue to invest and support, our teachers and our school leaders to use these strategies with a high degree of intentionality. And one example I will give you is even going into next school year, Florida is deploying its first stage of its new state standards. We had to completely move away from Common Core. We established our new benchmarks for excellent student thinking, so we refer to as our best standards. And the first stage of implementation is going to hit next year in our grades K through 2. And so we're doing these things all with the goals of, again, continuing to close gaps while still implementing and staying focused on the goals that we have, been very intentional about over the last several years.
Yeah, I appreciate you talking about that, because inevitably, because of the pandemic, we're going to have students coming back next year at very different levels, right, of success and achievement based upon a whole set of factors, right? What happened in their schools, what happened at home, how they were affected, were they in school, not in school. As you're thinking about this, I'm just wondering, are there specific interventions you are thinking about to help narrow those gaps, right? And help teachers understand what that individualized instruction might need to look like because of the wide variety likely to be seen in our classrooms.
And definitely. So one of the things that we've done, again, very intentionally, and I always like to brag on our partners, we're fortunate here in the state that we do have the Lastinger Center at the University of Florida. And they have really been leaders in this space of looking at the literacy matrix and the science of reading. And we've been fortunate that we've had, the Florida Center for Reading Research. We're leveraging these resources right now, very specifically to supporting teachers and getting more and more teachers trained in the implementation and the adoption of these strategies and practices that we know work well when deployed with a high degree of fidelity and just overall effectiveness. We've had reading coaches in our state for quite some time. Now we're moving in the direction of saying, okay, reading coaches are great, but what are the competencies and the supports that they need to be able to effectively support the teachers that are delivering direct instruction? So we've, again, partnered with these individuals, the 2 organizations I mentioned and others, saying, let's build out these competencies and support reading coaches. That is all things that we put $5 million into our CARES Act plan specifically for this year, next year, to help support that kind of implementation. Because we can talk about all the tools, all the interventions, we can talk about the best curriculums, but in the end, it comes back to the practitioners that are in front of our students delivering those supports. And if we invest in them, then in the end, that's going to be the best investment we can make. But giving them also those tools and resources where we put $20 million in just to help our K through 2 classrooms get more and more access to these curriculums and supports that will work when delivered with fidelity. We're following a lot right now with our work around implementation science. You know, some of the work that's gone in with a group called NERN, the National Implementation Research Network. We're looking at those types of frameworks as we're building out this continued capacity in this space. But, you know, in the end, support teachers, and in the end, they will support kids, and they will help deliver the outcomes that we know are important in this time.
That's great. John, here in New York, right, there's been a lot of discussion around health disparities, and that inevitably leads to educational disparities. And I know that you've been coordinating a lot with our Department of Health. Can you talk a little bit about how State Ed is thinking about these issues of disparities and you know, what that might look like for the school year next year?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the things we've thought a lot about, and again, you know, the challenges in the disparities. So, you know, for example, we get reports of, you know, in various areas of the state where a bunch of parents get together and they hire a teacher and they create what is known as pods, where after school, parents get their kids together and they hire a teacher. And the teacher provides tutorials on various subjects, where of course this is okay where parents can afford to pay, but we find that there are lots of places where parents can't afford to pay for this. One of the things we've thought about and we've talked about, and this would be something near and dear to your heart, Jason, was to use students who are enrolled in education programs leading to various certification areas and trying to engage them as they are getting close to completing their teaching certification requirements, engaging them in supplemental services. As Eric pointed out, you know, at the end of the day, it's the interaction between the teacher and the student. And to the extent that you can bring more instructional engagement in some way, shape, or form with people who know what they're talking about, so that so they're qualified to do this. That becomes critical. And so, I know that we're looking at various ways to get those resources to those areas of state where, you know, you just don't have the resources, the money, the income, the individual income to make that kind of commitment. And those are the students that probably need the additional work the most. And yeah, and again, it's not just teaching, it's those, again, the social emotional services that are needed and identifying them and communicating that so that the right people can be put in front of these students and their families to help them. We've heard stories and, where, moms are working and they have a sister and they bring their kids to their sister to watch them during the day. And so you've got 8 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment, trying to learn, each one on a computer, trying to learn as they, are engaged with their classwork on a computer. And so this is not the best environment. And can we look at alternative environments where the students are safe, the parents are comfortable, but that they can get instruction without maybe all of the distractions that come with it. So just another kind of challenge along the way, but I know we are, trying to address that. And we learn because, there's a lot of innovation in our districts in various parts of the state. And we try to learn from that and pass that along to other parts. So.
That's great. Stephanie, you talked about how the pandemic exacerbated some of these inequities. And so how are you thinking about some of this in California?
Well, as Eric mentioned, our goals have not changed from the beginning of our superintendent's tenure in 2019 around our opportunity gap. And that includes access and equity and academic opportunities, as well as all the pathway opportunities. And so we have used this time to ensure that in every decision that we make, that we're looking at how are we ensuring that whatever decision and practice we put in also addresses the opportunity gaps. And so Eric mentioned literacy. We have our state literacy plan that is being worked on right now, and involved in it is remote learning and in-person learning. And because that is the time that we're in, I don't think remote learning is ever going to go away for us. There's always going to be some version of it. And so that's an opportunity to make sure that we are addressing that within our state literacy plan, and how we focus that within our county offices and our support to our districts. Also, the digital divide that has been present from before the pandemic. It was amplified during the pandemic. And so our state superintendent has worked very closely with our legislative members, and there's actually several bills that are addressing the connectivity issue for our students and families. And then also all of our pathway supports for our career technical education, and ensuring that all of our Black and Brown students have equal access to our STEM opportunities. And so all of those elements are part of our work, and they were a part of our work before the pandemic.
One of the questions that we got from the group, from the participants, dealt with special education and the needs of students with special needs. Specifically, the question was any plans for remediation for kids with a diagnosis such as ADHD. Many kids who didn't have IEPs before probably need them now. Thinking about that question, but maybe raising it up a level too. But could you talk a bit about the impact of COVID on children with special needs, and how your states are thinking about those issues right now, and as we move forward? And I don't know, any volunteers who want to go first on this one?
We've actually had some sorry, John, if you want to take this. We've had some very targeted, intentional conversation with our special education leaders across the state in ensuring that assessments are still being provided to students during the pandemic, and that their services are also still being provided. They may look a little bit differently during the pandemic and remote learning, but we also have worked with our California Department of Public Health very closely, like John, and I'm sure Eric has in Florida, around translating their guidance to what it looks like in the classroom, specifically because it calls out bringing back small cohorts of students and serving our students with disabilities first within the small cohorts of students. So we made our students with disabilities a priority to bring them back into in-person instruction, and to ensure that all of the wraparound services were able to be provided to them in a safe manner. So we made those very intentional conversations.
Terrific. John?
Yeah, well, very much like Stephanie said, there was a lot of concern, obviously, for some special education students. Their health and safety was of primary concern. For some, they could be, very susceptible to COVID, and it could be life-threatening. So there was a lot of concern about that. But at the same time, recognizing that, you didn't want to have the kind of learning loss that, could just be devastating. So a lot of work, a lot of intentional conversations with various district superintendents about how to address these students' needs. And again, it was interesting because this was the one area where there was actually while there was a lot of flexibility requested, there was very little granted. The expectation was that districts were going to continue to provide the services consistent with the IEP, and work through some of those challenges. And if it required more resources, and if you required to do things a little bit differently, then so be it. It had to happen. And I'm not going to say there hasn't been any learning loss, and there's certainly continue to be challenges, but a lot of work has gone into addressing very real world concerns around students that have a range of special education needs.
Eric?
Jason, I would echo some of the same things, but I would say, one of the things that we had done even back, last spring is we worked with each district where they were designing, and we built off some of the success that local districts were already implementing. Florida has 5 of the 10 largest districts in the country, and Miami-Dade and a few others had already taken lead in having instructional continuity plans during periods of emergency or crisis. And Florida, knowing hurricanes, and sometimes we've had disruption from time to time on things, some of our districts really, learned to think about how do they deploy these services in ways that, we're able to adjust to some of these conditions that come up from time to time. But now, how do we learn from that, in the midst of the pandemic? So we built out a strategy where we were working with districts to train them on instructional continuity plans. We leaned on some of our districts that really had strong models of what those look like. That helped some of our rural districts. While we have 5 of the 10 largest, we also have some very small districts that are very rural, and building on that capacity of our system to again leverage those resources across districts was just really, really helpful. And then on top of that, when we were doing those 2 emergency orders, again, the one back in August for the fall semester, and then the one that we did in November preparing for the second half of the school year, one of the assurances that districts had to sign on to and really make sure was in place was the provision of special education services, even though it's required by law, all these things. We made sure that they made that a top priority for students that needed those on-campus services, needed those supports, needed, whether it was using strategies through, teleconferencing with parents or professionals or other practitioners that needed to deliver services. Those things were in place, in that, we wanted to make sure that first and foremost, our most vulnerable students were the ones that had the access to those in-person supports or those supports that were going to need to be delivered through other distance models. And again, I think we've seen some good success. And I think we've seen some good lessons about, things we can consider to do, going forward, about how you can engage parents that sometimes can't show up to an IEP meeting, but can participate through strategies like we're doing today. I think those are going to be some of the lessons learned that we can take forward with us as well, to better engage parents in ways that maybe in the past they hadn't been as comfortable with or acclimated to doing. But again, long story short, I would echo what my colleagues had said, but we tried to reinforce that through the orders and the supports that we were deploying here since last year.
So one thing maybe you all have talked about, right, is we want to make sure that we're learning as we move forward through all of this. And so, Eric, for you, what's one takeaway from this whole pandemic you hope that it stays with us as we move forward?
Yeah, it's hard to narrow that down to one thing, Jason.
I'm going to push you on it. I'll give you 2 if you need it, but see if you can prioritize.
I think one thing that we want to take forward with us and continue to build on is that, no matter how great technology might be and how you can deliver, different ways of, providing supports, that in the end, nothing's going to replace the ability of putting a great teacher in front of students to have a great access to education. And we got to always make sure that we keep that front and center. While it's always been a priority, and those of us that have been educators, I think we came to this work because we understand the power of what great educators can do. But I think in the end, how do we continue to build the capacity of our teachers, do the things that we've done to use the science that's related to literacy, the science of, creating accelerated opportunities for students. We're just going to build and double down on that during this period of time. And that for us is going to be a real key takeaway. While the technology and some of the tools that we've been learning through this time can be, definitely great supplements and add-ons to the work that we need to get done, and can remove some of the barriers for parents and others to be able to engage and access some of these other supports. Those are the things that we'll take with us as we go forward.
Great. Stephanie?
Well, I would echo what Eric said. I think that what I would add on is that our students are extremely resilient. And if the adults in the system would just pause for a minute and listen to our students, we would learn so much. And we would have systems that would be able to lift up, care, and educate each and every one of them if we just amplified those students' voices.
Terrific. Student voice. John?
Yeah, I think, so in New York, we had actually very little, there was very little, if any, remote learning. I mean, we were pretty much a, show up in class type of state, and there was no, remote option. So a couple of things, I mean, one of my hopes down the road is that now that we have had this, even if we go back to, a traditional in-person classroom, is the hope that we can use the technology to, as Eric mentioned, to supplement the education. I mean, I've heard again, anecdotally, teachers who will bring in, and colleges do this very often, who will bring in an expert on the subject. So you're teaching chemistry and you can bring in a renowned expert to talk to your class for 15 minutes, even if that expert happens to be sitting, across the country. So there can be a real value add there. New York State is focused to put a lot of emphasis on cultural responsive and sustaining curriculum. So you can bring experts from around the world actually to your classroom if you are willing, if you can do the work. Along with that is again supplementally, whether it's enrichment or it is catching people up. For those students that have additional needs, maybe we can use the technology to support, supplemental education, catch them up, and have others work with them, even when they're not in the classroom, to help them understand whatever coursework they're not getting or whatever, additional help they need. So I'm hoping that the technology, although again, however it ends up, full face-to-face, however, that we can continue to use the technology in ways that will help the kids.
Yeah, agreed. I think we've all learned a lot about ways that we can benefit from the technology and expanding, right, the reach around our communities around the U.S., even around the country, right, or around the world, bringing people and different voices into this. You've all talked a bit about the importance of teachers, right, in all of this, and we know that's the fact, right? They're the front line. They're helping students. One of the challenges we see also is getting more people to be interested in teaching right now. And we saw a survey results a couple of years ago. It was the first time that more than 50% of teachers would not encourage their own children to become teachers, which talks a lot about the changing environment of education even before the pandemic. And so your thoughts on how the pandemic may have influenced teachers now and what we could do to encourage more good people to come into teaching, because that pipeline is going to be, I think, more important than ever. Eric's leaning in. I'll go with you.
I'll start, but I think part of it is you got to continue to elevate the profession. It's again, very, very proud of the work that we've done here in Florida. I will say that, our governor was able to pass this year, right after the pandemic, we go back to March, we were still finishing up our budget. The governor vetoed over $1 billion of other projects and initiatives in the state to ensure that we were able to put $500 million into raising teacher salaries, beginning teacher salaries in the state. So we raised teacher salaries, all-time high, broke the record with moving it to 47.5 for beginning teachers here in the state, which was a really major increase. And that was, again, about elevating the profession. How do we start increasing the front line so that we're attracting talent to want to come into the profession itself? We've done a lot of work around recognition, and you've heard me talk a lot about professional development. I think we've still got more we can do, but we got to start building the pipeline on the front end as well. And then while we're doing that, celebrate and elevate the teaching profession so that, the best brand ambassadors for teaching are teachers. And, they're the ones in the classrooms in our high schools that can, really acknowledge and help kids get excited about this as a profession. And, I think that's where, a lot of it starts. I got my excitement by watching my parents teach, and they put the hook in me, and I could see that excitement in other teachers. And, I think we've tried to reinforce that culture by saying, let's recognize the profession and elevate it through increasing our base salaries. Let's get everybody up to this point, and then we will continue to build and work from there. But it sounds overly simplistic maybe when I talk about elevate the profession, but I think that's the kind of starting point. And again, we've made some tough decisions here in the state to make sure that we did not retreat from that commitment after the pandemic hit. And I think the governor is really just, again, he doubled down on that. And thanks to our legislature, they put the funding in the budget and he was able to support it and move that forward. And we've seen, again, these increases statewide, and it's making a difference. I think it's making a significant difference in getting more people interested in the profession.
Terrific. John, how about you?
Well, Jason, you and I kind of went around the state at one point in time, and that, we heard exactly what you just said, which was, teachers would not even recommend to their own students to go into the teaching profession. And for particularly some of the rural parts of New York, that's pretty much where you got your teachers from, was So, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, not only are we concerned about increasing the number of people in the profession, but we are very, very sensitive to and very concerned about the diversity of the teaching force. While the population has significantly diversified, student population is significantly diversified, you know, our teaching population has not, teaching and administrators. As Eric said, you know, we are actively engaged in trying to encourage and support Grow Your Own. I know that we have encouraged districts to reach out to various higher ed institutions that have ed programs to talk about, you know, potentially, you know, working with students while they're still in high school and encouraging them to go into ed preparation programs, which is a form of Grow Your Own. We have something called, that's funded by the state legislature under our My Brother's Keeper, which is funded annually at $20 million by the state legislature. One of the programs under the auspices of My Brother's Keeper is a Teacher Opportunity Corps, where we provide funding for students who want to go into the teaching profession. And that's anything from tuition reimbursement to support services and anything in between to help individuals. I think that, you know, one of the challenges, of course, is that while colleges, universities recruit, they recruit for general students. Ed programs usually don't have a recruitment budget, and you know, maybe that's something that we should look at, was giving the ed programs a little bit of money to go out and identify students who might be interested in going into the profession. And the other thing is, of course, talking about the benefits of the really nice things about the profession. I mean, young people today, you know, they want flexibility, they want some autonomy, they want a value add in their work. And so I think all of those things are things that, you know, can be had when you have a teaching career. So, you know, I know that we are working very closely with the New York State United Teachers and developing a program as well to advance, raise awareness, advertise, that kind of work to get more people interested, but certainly also get a more diverse group of people interested in the teaching career.
Terrific. Stephanie, how about California? How are you thinking about recruiting more teachers?
Well, all in the same ways that Eric and John talked about. I couldn't agree with you more, Eric, about elevating our profession as teachers. I think that is absolutely vital. And I'm hoping the pandemic showed the importance and the impact the teachers have on our young students and helps elevate it as well. Our state superintendent has made it a mission around teacher support, teacher retention, and diversifying our teacher pipeline. He's done this in a couple of different ways. First and foremost, around the teacher pathways within our high schools. So we have many schools that now have a teacher career pathway for our high schools that are in career and technical education pathways. And that is helping increase the pipeline, but also working with our higher education partners around what are the supports and the teacher preparation programs that we have in California, and how are they really truly preparing our teachers for the realities of our California classrooms, because they're very diverse and they're very complex, and our students come with a lot of complexities and a lot of assets. So making sure that we have that pathway there, and then also diversifying our teacher workforce. Our state superintendent has a bill right now going forward to help diversify the teacher workforce and focus in on creating more pipelines for our teachers of color. And then also teacher residency programs. We have a very large teacher residency program. And on top of that, we also have programs for housing, provide teachers housing in our more expensive areas of California, that the pay rate may be a little bit lower than the cost of living. And so there's teacher housing programs that many of our districts have put in place, and our superintendent has supported that work. And then also teacher retention. So we can have a great pool of teachers, but if we're not supporting them and focusing on retaining them, then we're going to keep being in the same cycle. And we know from all of the research and from practice that our principals have a very key role in teacher retention. And so looking at how we're supporting our principals to ensure that they are creating a culture and environment that is extremely supportive for teachers to be able to impact our students' academics and growth.
No, that's terrific, and it is an ecosystem that we need to be thinking about, and we're all in this together. I think as a higher ed institution to train teachers, we want more good teachers, but we know that part of that's working with our districts to develop those pipelines, to encourage folks to come through, and particularly as we think about diversifying the teacher education pipeline, that's become so critical for us here in New York as well. So just a couple of last maybe minute questions here, and maybe a fun one, but could you name a blog, a feed, or a listserv that you read that keep up with developments in education when you have time to do such things?
I have a few. Like
I
read a lot. So PACE, LPI, all of those, the research entities, but also Emily Freitag's blog. I read hers often because it's really getting into the details around instructional practices and our systems for students.
Great. John, anything you're reading right now and keeping up on things?
Politico, I think I catch on a regular basis. I'm blanking, Jason, but there is a good blog put out with regard to charter schools. As you know, we have a large number of charter schools in New York State. Many of them chartered by the Board of Regents, but some chartered by the State University of New York. SUNY system, and so keeping up with that, so I do tap into that occasionally.
Eric, you?
Well, lately it's been reading a lot of legislation and bills and things like that, just because that's the time of year that we're in. But I'll tell you, I think being able to understand some of the different hurdles and challenges and commonalities that states are all navigating right now, I don't know if I'd call them anything like a blog or anything other than just great resources, leaning on groups like CCSSO to help keep us connected on things that are happening out there with trends and sharing resources, looking at, organizations even like Chiefs for Change that's been able to engage a lot of resources and share that with state chiefs. Those are some of the groups that, I've been leaning on pretty heavily that I would say trying to pay attention to trends, things that they're seeing to keep us informed about emerging policy and things that are coming out. Those have just been things that I think I found valuable to kind of, look outside my own state and see what are some of the other things that everybody else is navigating and leaning on those networks to, again, listen, learn, and collaborate and coordinate and share what we can.
Great. So one more quick one. What's a leadership lesson that you have learned from the past year?
There's so many. Just one?
You can give us two. That's all right.
Eric, you can go first.
I mean, I would just, I think it's something that probably we all know, or else we wouldn't be doing the work that we do. But I think the sheer power of collaboration and coordination. I would tell you, if it wasn't for the work that we were doing hand in hand with our superintendents to do the things that we had to get done, it would have been a lot more challenging. And I think that collaboration versus it being anything that was, not coordinated or working together hand in hand. I mean, collaboration to me has been just the real power of our success here in Florida, and being able to look at that collectively and how do we lean on each other for collective impact in this work has been just, I think, a real powerful piece for me that, again, always recognized it, but it's one thing to recognize and it's another thing to live through it and see the power of that during the midst of a crisis or a pandemic.
I think that listening to multiple perspectives, I've always known that is super important, especially coming from the classroom and being a principal. But in this crisis moment, it's understanding that everybody's affected differently and they're impacted differently. And so hearing their stories and acknowledging their stories and learning from their stories. And it goes back to Eric talking about collaboration, tons of collaboration with our associations, our labor associations and our management associations and our equity stakeholder groups, along with our students and parents and teachers. If we weren't listening and working together then we wouldn't be where we're at. And so that listening and learning from each other has been vital for us to be able to move forward in any way.
John?
Yeah, I would echo what my colleague said. The collaboration and the coordination are critical, and when you're going through it, it becomes so important. The only other thing that I would add, Jason, is the need to, for me, the need to be more deliberate and more careful about avoiding unintended consequences. It's very important to think through carefully what it is you want to do, because it's very easy to, either send a mixed message or inconsistent message. And in your haste to be responsive, you can actually, so being reflective about, what you're doing and what your decisions are, I think also became critical. As my colleague said, it's always been there, but with the pandemic and the heightened sense of urgency, it was even more important.
So last question. We often have a lot of students tune into this to listen and learn. What advice would you have for those moving into education as a career and just starting?
I would say enter it with a growth mindset. That every day you're going to learn something new. Don't think that you know it all, because you don't. And so listen to the voices around you and learn and grow from them.
John?
I would say that it can be such a rewarding career wherever whether you're at the higher ed level or the P-12 level, whatever area you want to focus on, or you want to be an administrator. However, it can be so rewarding. There are so many people who benefit from the work that people do. And my wife is a teacher. We go out, we run into kids, who are now, 20 years later, who still recognize her and thank her for, her sixth grade social studies class 20 years ago. This happens on almost a regular basis. And so I just, it can be difficult and challenging, but it can be so rewarding.
Eric?
So again, I would echo everything I've heard, but I think saying, welcome to the best career and the best work that you can do. I mean, there is no doubt, and sometimes it sounds cliche because we've all been in this, but you talk about coming into a career, into a field where it is really about transforming lives and creating opportunities. That's really what it's about. And like any career, I mean, it doesn't matter what job you go into. Any job you go into is going to have its challenges. It's going to have its hurdles. And like anything, you're going to refine and fine tune your skills and be very effective in the trade as you continue to develop those competencies to be a more effective, educator. We've all been there. We remember those first days in the classroom. You remember those challenges and those hurdles. And sometimes, you're thinking, Lord, kids are very challenging and they bring all these, personalities that sometimes you're trying to work through. But, in the end, the point that John brought up about, kids that come back, they recognize the parents, and again, know that little by little, you're changing the trajectory of lives. And, that job has never been more important. It's always been critical. We know it's been the framework and the foundation of our society with what great teachers can do. But I think in this moment, coming through a pandemic, and as we see more and more kids come back into our institutions and into our classrooms, that job is going to be, I don't even know how to define it. I mean, it's an unbelievable career that's going to be, unbelievably critical to the future of our states and to our communities and ultimately to our nation. So we need you, and get ready for an unbelievable ride.
Well, that is a terrific way, I think, to bring this conversation to a close. So Dr. Stephanie Gregson from the California Department of Education, Dr. Eric Hall, Florida Department of Education, and Dr. John DeGatti, New York State Education Department and UAlbany alum, I should have noted earlier. My thanks to all of you for taking the time out of what I know is an incredibly busy schedule. But we are indebted to you for sharing your knowledge, for learning with us along the way, and for all your leadership in each of your states. You've guided your respective education systems and your students through this incredible marathon of a crisis. My thanks also to our partners with West Ed, the Lussinger Center at the University of Florida, and Cognia for being part of this webinar as well. So with that, we will bid you all adieu and wish you a great night, and we hope you tune in for our next episode. Take care.